Good afternoon and good evening. I'm James Cockayne. I'm the New South Wales Anti-slavery Commissioner. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the second day of the third edition of the Anti-slavery Forum, this edition online. I'm joining you today from Bundjalung country in the northeast of New South Wales, and you're welcome to drop into the Q&A where you're joining us from today. Perhaps you're also joining from unceded First Nations lands here in Australia. We're also very thrilled to be joined today by a number of international guests who'll be speaking with us shortly. My role here is simply one of housekeeping, just to make sure that we all know where the exits are and also what the ground rules are for today as we go through. So I'd like to acknowledge that we are all, or most of us, as I said, are on unceded lands of First Nations peoples. Here at the Office of the Anti-Slavery Commissioner, we acknowledge elders past and present, and we'd like to point out that First Nations peoples are, in many cases here in Australia, individual and community survivors of practices that today would constitute modern slavery and continue to deal with the impacts and legacies of those practices. Next slide, please. We find it very important in these conversations in the anti-slavery space in New South Wales to work together to make a safe, brave space for these conversations. And to do so, we've published Brave Space guidelines. You can find them on our website, and you see an overview of those guidelines here. 8 principles that really drive the way we try to interact with each other when we're discussing these issues. I'm not going to go through them in detail with you today, but please do have a look at the Brave Space guidelines on our website. And I invite all of the panelists today, and you, if you're engaging in the Q&A section of the broadcast, to consider these principles and seek to apply them in the way that you discuss these issues today. If anything we discuss today raises concerns or triggers issues for you, you're welcome to reach out for help and support to any of these particular places. We offer a confidential advice and support line through my office. That's 1-800-FREEDOM, 1-800-37-33-36 for people who have suffered or think that they may have suffered or may know others suffering modern slavery. We also recommend reaching out to Anti-Slavery Australia for legal advice, to My Blue Sky around forced marriage issues, or indeed directly to the additional referral pathway that can assist people who've suffered human trafficking and modern slavery in Australia. If you're calling in internationally, if you're watching internationally, follow the QR code there at the right for appropriate mental health helplines in your country. Finally, I should mention that we will be making some counselling supports available. Details of those will be available later in the broadcast. They'll be available free of charge to anybody who might need support after this event for 1 hour after the event closes. But it's my great pleasure now to welcome our panel for this next discussion on buying for good. And I'm going to turn over to my colleague, the Principal Policy Manager in my office, Lucy Forbes. Over to you, Lucy.
Thank you very much, James, and thank you to everyone joining us today for the second day of our online anti-slavery forum. I'm joining you today from the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So what do we mean when we talk about social procurement, and what relevance does it have to modern slavery? I think when we think of the role of government in combating modern slavery, we often think first about the creation of modern slavery laws and of frontline agencies who investigate crimes and support victim survivors. And while these aspects are critical, government agencies are also really important economic actors. They buy a lot of things. The New South Wales government, for example, procures around $42 billion worth of goods and services annually. And this puts governments in a position to use their market power to achieve positive social outcomes, including through their response to modern slavery risks that exist in their supply chains. Several jurisdictions, including New South Wales, but also the UK and many places in the EU, have introduced public social procurement policies, including expectations of anti-slavery and human rights due diligence and remediation. So with that said, I want to introduce 4 panelists who have really extensive experience in public procurement and responsible supply chain management. So Laura McManus is a director at the Office of the Australian Anti-slavery Commissioner. She is a leading business and human rights practitioner with more than 10 years' experience implementing human rights due diligence in global supply chains, including as head of human rights at Woolworths Group. Nick O'Reilly is the Executive Director of Procurement Policy, Risk and Delivery at New South Wales Treasury. And he's responsible for shaping reform policies that enhance value for money, support local businesses and ensure procurement compliance. He has decades of experience across Australia, New Zealand and the UK, and has worked in a range of sectors including financial services, insurance, government and non-profit. Pauline Gothberg is the National Coordinator for the Swedish region's work on sustainable public procurement and has over 13 years' experience in public administration. And she's also worked at the OECD as a policy analyst on a project to leverage responsible business conduct through public procurement. And finally, Kristen Talbot is European legal advisor at the Responsible Contracting Project and an independent business and human rights lawyer who works at the intersection of law, procurement and human rights. And she regularly integrates the Responsible Contracting Project's toolkit into her work, including in the Swedish region's supplier guidance on sustainable supply chains. So I'll start by asking you, Nick. The New South Wales government's currently implementing a range of social procurement and anti-slavery reforms in line with recommendations from Parliament. How do these reforms integrate social and modern slavery considerations with a view to creating better social outcomes? And how does addressing modern slavery risks in public supply chains create social value for the people of New South Wales?
Hi, Lucy. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for the question. Nice to see you here, and thanks for the opportunity of coming along and speaking. I'm quite new into this space. I've only been in the role for about 8 weeks now in Treasury, but I'm pretty excited to be speaking to you about this. And I think, you know, government, in particular New South Wales government, has a real focus in this space. You mentioned $42 billion, Lucy, of spend in New South Wales, and I was Googling that last night thinking, gee, that's a lot, isn't it, that we spend on goods and services and construction and all these things. And I was Googling how much is 42 billion. It's actually the same as the GDP of Cambodia and Nepal, right? So it's a huge amount of spend, and we've, you know, got some real, you know, obligations there to do the right thing. And I think there is a lot happening in the kind of you know, procurement space. Our minister is very. We've got a minister of procurement is very focused on this. There was a parliamentary inquiry last year with 30 recommendations, and the government supported all those recommendations really. And I guess one of the recommendations around modern slavery is mandating the use of tender and contract clauses in government, and ensuring these contracts, you know, we had, you know, appropriate oversight and working with our agency partners, you know, to bring that to life and have a real focus on that. And I think, you know, New South Wales procurement, you know, works closely with the Anti-slavery Commissioner's office to implement these recommendations across government in a really effective way. You know, there's the guidance on reasonable steps and the benchmark. I think because we procure, you know, as I said, so much, and we've got, you know, I believe about 7,000 procurement practitioners across New South Wales government, all trying to do the right thing and giving guidance and frameworks to do the right thing is really important. And I guess, I would say that, you know, the reforms we are trying to implement aren't piecemeal. They're pretty integrated. The focus that we've got in New South Wales on local procurement is really important. There's a focus on making sure that 30% of tenders going forward are focused on local. So there's a real oversight on creation of jobs and making sure that agencies and suppliers are doing the right thing, particularly with the topic we're talking about today. Ethical supply chains is really important, and we work closely with agencies. An example would be something that's quite topical at the moment is modern slavery around production, overseas production, particularly with battery-powered or electric vehicles, electric buses and things, and making sure that the supply chain does adhere to the right parameters and the right frameworks, and making sure there's the appropriate checks and balances really to make sure that we're ethical in everything we do in the government here, because it is critically important.
Oh, thanks very much, Nick. And I think as New South Wales moves forward in implementing those recommendations of Parliament, we can also learn from some of the practice overseas. So I'll turn to Pauline on that note. The Swedish region's initiative on sustainable public procurement has been running now for about 15 years, and it's a really good case study of successful collaboration to address human rights risks in public procurement. It's generated shared codes of conduct, model contract clauses, as Nick was discussing earlier, and also targeted action to address specific sectoral risks. So could you share some insights and lessons learned from this initiative, and any cases that sort of demonstrate the value of this collaboration for you?
Yes, thank you. Good evening and good morning, and thank you so much for the invitation. It's a great honor and pleasure to join this discussion. Thank you for the question, Lizzie. I want to highlight two key lessons. The first, of course, is power of collaboration, and the other one is the need to support SMEs to build capacity. So there are 21 regions in Sweden responsible for healthcare and public transport. They have their own political assemblies and collect their own taxes. But faced with similar human rights risks and limited resources, of course, the chief procurement officers and chief sustainability officers have established a national secretariat to support the procurement departments. So, procurement is supposed to solve many societal goals, but you cannot really expect procurement officers to be expert in all these areas. But they need to know what to do at each stage of the procurement processes. So nationally, we do risk assessments on all our purchasing categories and prioritize which to focus on. Obviously, we buy everything from tea bags to MR cameras, so we can't do everything. So currently, we're focusing on 16. And for modern slavery, for example, we prioritize medical gloves, IT, textiles, and dressing and wound care products. And also we share those assessments with our SMEs, who have sometimes little resources. We also developed harmonized due diligence requirements fully aligned with the UN Guiding Principles and the OECD guidelines, which are all included into the contracts. But putting these requirements into our contracts is absolutely necessary, but it's far from sufficient. You also need to follow up on those. And since the regions use exactly the same criteria, we share the same supplier base, we can pool resources and do joint follow-up. So we use different methods for addressing different risks, if you would like, to check that our direct suppliers have implemented their due diligence processes. We do office audits. But maybe to check, modern slavery, we do factory audits in sourcing countries. And in markets where that is difficult, such as China, for example, we try other methods. Now we're using isotope testing for testing if our cotton is being grown in Xinjiang, for example. So although resources are still a challenge, I think this approach is much more cost effective, and I think also over time has strengthened our ability to address issues like modern slavery, for example. the other point I would like to make is that, over 70% of our suppliers are SMEs, and we don't want to stifle competition. So therefore, to support them to fill our requirements is really important. I already mentioned that we share our risk assessments, but we have developed like an extensive guidance. Christine has helped us with that. It's both in English and Swedish, of course. We developed land risk indexes that we provide for free, e-learnings, other trainings and tools. And we're also financing, the office audits and the re-audits. And to be quite, honest, I mean, this is basically free consultancy for suppliers to detect where the gaps are. And I think also many suppliers see it as that way. So in these 15 years, it has not decreased competition and the number of suppliers, and nor has these requirements increased costs for our products. And I think you also have many testimonies that these requirements has made SMEs more competitive and able to manage their risk in their supply chains better. So, thank you.
Thanks, Pauline. That's really, really interesting to see, what a comprehensive system that the Swedish regions have been able to put in place, and also the sort of successes of it, the fact that it hasn't ultimately increased costs and, it hasn't barred SMEs from the markets. It's a real illustration of how, these requirements actually do support competition. Laura, turning to you now, coming from really extensive experience in the private sector, what approaches have you seen work for businesses when they're embedding anti-slavery considerations into their buying activities? And how can we apply these or leverage these within the public sector?
Yeah, thanks, Lucy, and good evening, everyone. As you mentioned, I'm not a public procurement expert, so I'm definitely going to offer these observations based on largely my corporate knowledge and the reading of a few of the government's modern slavery statements. But that said, I think we heard Nick also point to the volume and the spend that we see in public procurement, which are certainly some of the largest across the country. So I certainly don't envy public procurement professionals out there. For example, if you look at the Commonwealth's latest modern slavery statement, they reported entering into, I think, 83,000 contracts with a total value of $99.6 billion. So by comparison, if I look at the private sector, Australia's largest retailers and mining companies, for example, are reporting working with about 15 to 20,000 suppliers. So on the scale, you can see already the volume in public procurement. But I think given these numbers, a really good place to start on lessons learned from the private sector is really the need for a robust and methodologically sound risk assessment that actually helps prioritise where you put your actions. Clearly, with so many suppliers, it's impossible and actually indeed unnecessary when you think about a human rights due diligence process to conduct action on them all. So just like the private sector, I think there's opportunity for the public sector to justify what they're prioritising, why they're doing so, and even what supplying categories might be out of scope of their due diligence efforts. Equally, and again, I don't think private sectors necessarily nailed this either, but risk assessments are not a set and forget. So, even companies might report on doing an annual risk assessment, but really, if we look over the last couple of years, the volatile nature of global supply chains, be it the pandemic, conflict, extreme weather events, these create shocks in the system, and then they often create spikes in demand for either certain products or shifting supply from certain regions. Those demands often increase human rights risks, actually, and companies might be required to conduct heightened human rights due diligence in a short amount of time. I think this could be a really good lesson learned that might go onto the public procurement agenda. The second, and I'm not saying this just because I'm a business and human rights practitioner, but I do think, there is a need for subject matter expertise, both in procurement teams, whether they're private or public. So you have someone there who has the technical skills to review, analyse, and then recommend the course of action. It's not enough these days to send out a questionnaire and take no action based on the response or receive an audit report if you don't have the technical expertise to then make an informed decision about what you're doing. So thinking about the resourcing to effectively engage with your suppliers is another key takeaway. I think on that note, of course, AI and automation can help get you so far. Pauline, you just said it, we can't expect our procurement teams to do it all. So we need to find ways to support procurement teams as well with increasing demand on the types of things that they're looking at. Very briefly, and thirdly, is meaningful engagement with impacted stakeholders. We're seeing many more companies now using different forms of worker voice mechanisms, be that through conducting in-person forums, deploying surveys, either through apps or in person again, and outreach through migrant worker centres. I'm not sure the extent of this is happening in public procurement, but certainly I'm sure private sector colleagues in Australia would be very happy to share their experience. And finally, I think you need to make sure that your right hand is talking to the left, so that your sustainability or modern slavery policy objectives are weighted and considered in purchasing decisions. So often there's nothing more frustrating to a supplier to think that they've jumped through different hoops to meet your requirements, only to have another company that might not have the same level of oversight win the business. I'm sure Nick's on the line thinking, it's not that simple, and certainly there are a lot of factors at play in a purchasing decision. But I think it's important, nearly for the legitimacy of all of our work, to be able to demonstrate how your modern slavery requirements are being considered alongside cost. So I might leave it there for some ongoing lessons.
Great, thanks very much, Laura. And I think sort of leading in from that, having those kind of conversations with suppliers on an ongoing basis about what expectations are in relation to modern slavery throughout the whole procurement cycle is sort of really key to that. And on that note, Kristen, I might pass over to you to talk about the role that contract clauses play in communicating those expectations around modern slavery risk management to suppliers and really to the market at large.
Well, thank you, Lucy. So contract clauses. So right now, today, I'm going to take a public buyer perspective on contract clauses, but everything that I say actually applies also to private buyers. So contract clauses are a critical tool in public procurement. We all know that. And it's not just about setting rules and enforcing legal obligations. It's also about values and norms and sending the signal to the market. But today, most public contracts fall short. There are a few exceptions to this, and one of those is the New South Wales Anti-slavery Commissioner's model contract clauses on this specific issue. But most fall short, and they tend to shift the risks rather than manage them systematically. By this, I mean shifting them to suppliers. And the same usually applies also to the suppliers, the private suppliers to the public sector. They also tend to shift risks in the supply chains. And this is also illustrated by a relatively recent report from the US government accountability offices on human trafficking in federal contracts. As you might know, the US has actually been spearheading the work on human trafficking for 2.5 decades. They are the ones collecting the trafficking in persons report that many of us are using all the time, indirectly or directly. But what the GAO found was that their own agencies were not complying with federal anti-trafficking requirements in most of the reviewed contracts. Instead, they focused on ticking boxes instead of embedding risks. So right now, the GAO is urging the federal agencies in the US to adopt a different approach, where they would instead manage human rights risk, especially trafficking risks in their contracts. And this, in general, highlights a striking gap because while many contracts fall short, they also hold enormous potential. And contracts matter because they're at the heart of procurement, whether public or private. And they can be used to operationalize 3 key principles. And these are the 3 key principles of the responsible contracting project. So first of all, shared responsibility. So this means that the buyer and the supplier, in this case, the public buyer, commit to upholding, both of them commit to upholding human rights and environmental standards. The second one is responsible purchasing practices. So in this case, it would be the public buyer committing to supporting the suppliers, not undermining their work on human rights and environmental standards. This can be things such as paying fair prices, but just including sustainability criteria, or give them sufficient weight in the tendering process. So there's different way you can do this. And then thirdly, remediation first. If harms occurs, the contract prioritizes remedies for victims, not just remedies for the public buyer. And contract termination is meant to be seen as a last resort, only after other options have been exhausted. That said, I want to highlight that for, at least in Sweden, I assume it's similar also in Australia, that there are certain limitations for public buyers on what they can do in terms of remediation. So in Sweden, there is restrictions on how you can use public funds. So it would be difficult for the Swedish regions, for instance, to actually do financial payouts. But what they can do is use their leverage to ensure that the entity that is actually causing or contributing to the adverse impact, that they remedy it. So, and then I want to highlight that in my experience, public buyers actually already leave space for remediation, because the way I've seen it happen is that many public buyers see termination as a last resort for other reasons, because it's burdensome to relaunch the tender. So there's, you know, you're trying over and over again to not end the contracts, and that gives actually room for discussing these things and working on these things together. So I think what needs to happen is that the wording or how we phrase the contracts also need to reflect this, that there is space for remediation here. And then two last points. So one of them is that when we talk about responsible or shared responsibility and responsible purchasing practices, it's one thing to see it as between the public buyer and the supplier. And there's another thing that we can also do, and that's to nudge the suppliers to do that in relation to their suppliers. So in the guidance that Pauline was talking about, we have including these kinds of nudges. So the responsible contracting project toolkit is interspersed in different places in this guidance. And as you heard Pauline talk about, that even though the Swedish regions contract clauses do not explicitly say shared responsibility, the way Pauline and her team is working actually is shared responsibility through the guidance, the templates, the e-learnings, the shared cost of audits, or the cost of audits and the risk assessments. And one more thing that Pauline forgot to highlight is that we have recently included, because I do this work for her, we've recently included responsible exits in their escalation ladder. So there's lots of different ways you can work on shared responsibility. And then I just also wanted to highlight that in the EU right now, the Public Procurement Directive is under renegotiation. So there's opportunity here to, for the first time, formally include human rights and environmental due diligence in public procurement, not just in countries such as Sweden and the Netherlands and a few others that are front runners here, but actually requiring this from all public buyers across the EU. So I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Kristen. And really important to highlight those concepts of, shared responsibility and remediation. I think, we see a lot of modern slavery clauses that are, as you said, very much sort of reps and warranties style. And certainly in creating the model contract clauses that our officers put together, we, worked very closely with the model used by defined by the Responsible Contracting Project, and, really it really sort of sets a huge amount of sort of leverage for procurement officers when they're thinking about modern slavery due diligence and remediation there. Before I go back around to the panelists, I do want to encourage anyone who's online, if you have any questions for our panelists, please do pop them in the Q&A. But to come back to you, Nick, I think this is something that we've talked about a little bit, or Pauline, both Pauline and Laura have mentioned a little bit, but government procurement officers, have a huge amount on their plate. They manage overlapping policy and regulatory considerations when buying. How do they ensure, or how do policymakers ensure that when we create anti-slavery obligations, they reinforce and work with these other policies and objectives, and don't just, create additional red tape for officers?
Yeah, it's a great question and pretty important, isn't it? I think, we kind of think of sustainable procurement as non-mutually exclusive. We've got a number of things at play in New South Wales. We've got Indigenous procurement, disability, environmental, anti-slavery, and it's a lot to understand and a lot to get across for agencies and suppliers. And I think really, I guess there are two main things to consider. This can be, led by government and having that cohesive social procurement policy, which, this government's really focused on, or it can be led by the procurement practices and agencies itself. And I think, I'm pretty buoyed, I guess, by my colleagues that I work with. We've got a project leadership group that meet monthly that talk about, how we can, procurement practitioners can come up to speed with some of these new regulations and reforms and share best practice. And I guess, originally, the regulation for, modern slavery is reasonably new. And, the feedback was in that first year, it was for practitioners to sort of focus on compliance and what they needed to understand to comply with the legislation. But, moving forward to 2025, I guess it's more about, how can agencies across the government work together and share best practice that integrates these social procurement policies. I guess an example would be agencies have been looking at how to streamline modern slavery due diligence. Some of the agencies are going through risk management platforms to provide information on potential suppliers, not just on modern slavery, but transparency, reputational and legal and risk and financial. So I think there's a lot of that information sharing and best practice that I've seen, and as the agencies that we deal with come up to speed and increase their knowledge and maturity of the subject matter, to share best practice. And I think that's really encouraging, because a lot of the practitioners aren't experts in this. I think a couple of the panel members have mentioned before, it's evolving the subject matter and trying to get it across this and share information across practitioners is really important. I guess it's about the intention, best intentions with modern slavery and doing the right thing. And like I said, I'm really buoyed by my colleagues, the chief procurement officers across the different agencies, whether it's transport or education or health or all the other agencies that we deal with, are working really hard on what needs to be done to make sure, one, we're compliant, but two, we're actually doing the right thing when we make decisions and work with individual suppliers to making sure, that they have ethical supply chains. So, yeah, I think there's work to do, but the feedback I've had from colleagues that have in New South Wales government that have been on this journey longer than I, there's certainly progress being made, which is very exciting and impressive.
Oh, absolutely, Nick. And I think, as the sort of sophistication of procurement officers in addressing these issues and in understanding modern slavery, due diligence, and really building that into the work they do. As that evolves, the sophistication of the market in picking up on those requirements will also evolve. And on that note, Pauline, how has Sweden's approach to public procurement, do you think, impacted sort of broader awareness of human rights risks in the market? Have you seen improvements in human rights performance, particularly for those purchasing categories that you've prioritised? And are there challenges that still exist?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, of course, there are challenges, I have to admit. But maybe I can just give you a real life example that public procurement actually can make a difference. I mentioned that, since factory audits are costly and very time consuming, we don't do as many. But after media reports and human rights defenders on modern slavery in the medical gloves industry in Malaysia, we commissioned or conducted 3 factory audits. We don't do broad social audits because they don't detect what we want to detect, but we did a risk-based audit focusing on modern slavery. And what we found in these 3 factories were really bad. There were confiscated passports, excessive overtime. Workers were working between 130 and 140 hours overtime, and we stipulate 48 hours in our contracts. Management was hitting employees, and debt bondage were severe amongst the migrant workers, especially the ones from Bangladesh who had to pay up to $5,000 to get a job in Malaysia. If you compare that to a monthly salary of $278, you can understand that this takes some time to repay those debts. And also living conditions were atrocious. So in the period just after we got these reports, we struggled with getting any intention for, remediation, because our suppliers were really small buyers in those factories. I mean, one of the factories were actually Top Glove, which is one of the biggest suppliers in the world. But after the CPB, Customs and Border Protection in the US, got hold of the reports, and they also issued a withhold release order for Top Glove, then things really started to change. So in the time after these audits, we've seen great improvements, living conditions, working hours, abuses. They implemented zero-cost recruitment policies, but that is very much forward-looking. There were still some struggles to achieve, kind of what they should do with the debt that the workers were in. But in the end, these 3 factories actually agreed to repay or remediate those migrant workers that was, heavily in debt with $54 million. So, public procurement can actually make a big difference and working together.
That's a really fantastic case study and, some really sort of almost boots on the ground work that was done by the Swedish regions in that instance. Laura, sorry, excuse me. Laura, I'll turn to you. Another one of the successes of the Swedish approach to public procurement has been its sort of sectoral approach to managing risk. Which sectors in the Australian market do you think would really benefit from this approach, a collaborative approach by public and private buyers to reduce modern slavery risks in supply chains?
Thanks, Lucy. I think firstly, I'd like to respond to Pauline's narrative just then. I think we could only dream of that type of collaboration and sector-based response in Australia, Pauline. So it is really terrific to be able to hear from you and the types of remediation that you're able to achieve in that particular case. It is definitely standout. So good coordination to get these guys on the line for this conversation. I think where I would start around sector-based collaboration is does also come to a question of leverage. I think as Pauline touched on in that example, and many on the line would be familiar, of course, with the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which sets out the normative framework that many on the call, public and private, would be using as part of their modern slavery response. I think it's worth reminding ourselves that the UNGPs also encourage collaboration, including with peers, to enhance your leverage or influence, especially when you might not be able to resolve issues alone, and again, as Pauline just mentioned. But in terms of where I think Australian entities might be able to increase sector-based collaboration, looking to the Commonwealth's latest modern slavery statement, they have identified a number of high-risk areas, including ICT, so computer technologies and hardware, cleaning and security services, investments, textiles and construction. I certainly think they are a very good place to start and would be relevant. Other sectors, of course, that come to mind are things like renewable energy, equipment and procurement, and logistics. Australia is, of course, an island country or an island continent, and logistics, both coming to us and throughout the very vast country, I think is another interesting sector. But another way to think about collaboration is also issues-based collaboration. So if we think about something like responsible recruitment, again, it's a national issue, and it cross-cuts, in fact, across a number of high-risk sectors. So a joint public and private sector response in something, taking a thematic lens like responsible recruitment, might not just look at a due diligence approach and remediation, but also things like root causes and also policy positions. So a different lens to the collaboration can also enable a kind of different thinking as well. And in the example of responsible recruitment, it could also prompt movement towards things like a national labour hire licensing regime, which would benefit both public and private actors. Again, thinking through other forms of collaboration, Pauline also just touched on it, is a lot of modern slavery risk exists beyond the first year, deep in supply chain. So how we might be able to coordinate on specific high risk investigations, I think, is something also worth exploring. Certainly for our office, sector-based collaborations, is to ensure that we're de-siloing efforts and not duplicating where we can, is top of our agenda.
No, thank you very much, Laura. And yeah, I mean, I echo your appreciation of Pauline's or the Swedish region's ability to get that sectoral collaboration going so comprehensively to achieve that successful remediation. And also, it's really interesting to see that collaboration between the sort of policy parts of government, looking at responsible recruiting and the procurement angle there as well. So finally, coming to you, Christian, how can procurement officers engage their suppliers on modern slavery clauses to ensure that these obligations generate better risk management practices along the value chains?
Well, I think what needs to happen is that you need to embed modern slavery risk management throughout the procurement cycle. It's not just about the contracts. So first, engagement should begin during market dialogue and pre-tender phases. What's in Sweden it's called request for information and referrals. I don't know the terms in Australia, but that's what we do during the pre-tender stages. That's when we invite suppliers to provide input on the design of contracts and pre-qualification and things like that. So I think engaging suppliers already there on, for instance, what is a reasonable traceability requirement to try to get to the bottom of these things in the supply chain. This kind of engagement can also partly be done outside of specific tender processes. So in Sweden, when the Swedish regions and other central purchasing body and the National Agency for Public Procurement, when they developed the most recent set of due diligence clauses, that was done through almost, I think, 1 year, at least 9 months long stakeholder engagement process with suppliers, public buyers, trade unions, and civil society. So that's also a way that you can do it and have these issues high up on the agenda. And then if you use pre-qualification and selection or award criteria in a proper way, they can signal a shift from box ticking to this more collaborative approach that you want to achieve, including for traceability efforts. And when you reach the contracting stage, we've already talked about, that's about the shared responsibility, the responsible purchasing practices and remediation first. Another example of new contract clauses that take this into account is Electronics Watch's contract clauses. I think several Australian public buyers are members of Electronics Watch, just as the Swedish regions. And then also during the contracting stage or finalizing the contracting stage, it's also important to actually explain these contract clauses to the suppliers so that they understand what the requirements are. And once the contract is in place, you move into contract management, and Pauline has given really good examples of what that could look like. And here it's important to, we're talking about modern slavery here, and the work that the Swedish regions are doing in terms of factory audits, that is for severe adverse impact. So it is forced labor and, potentially child labor and things like that. So ultimately, if you engage suppliers through every step of the procurement process and align the work all along, this creates a foundation for better risk management throughout the supply chain. So that's the way to do it, ideally.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Kristen. So finally, a rapid fire round, just a question for all of you. Where do you see as the key opportunity for government buying practices to, within the next 5 years, move the market towards better modern slavery risk management? And I'll reverse the order and start with you, Kristen.
Yes, thank you. Well, embedding and being proactive. So even if the EU is now revising the Public Procurement Directive, European or EU governments can be front runners, just as the Swedish government can be, and then modeling the good behavior. I think that's really important here, that we really see ourselves, or the public sector really sees themselves as part of this supply chain. So if we model good behavior, that can have a ripple effect on suppliers and the supply chain in general. And lastly, I want to mention that the Responsible Contracting Project is currently working on identifying ways to improve government purchasing practices. So ideally, we would have model contract clauses from the Responsible Contracting Project for public buyers. There are certain peculiarities that we need to take into account when developing these. And right now, Ben Rutledge and I are working on a primer where we're explaining these things, and that will be on the website within a month or two, I think. We're also looking for partners in this work. So if public buyers in Australia want to be part of discussing what model contract clauses could look like, just reach out to the Responsible Contracting Project. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Kristen. Laura?
I took some notes from our Swedish colleagues throughout the session, and I think they've mentioned shared responsibility, responsible purchasing practices, and finding pathways for remediation for public procurement, I think would be a really important place for Australia to head. And then I think specifically there's also a really good opportunity for us to drive some change via national cabinet. So mainstreaming sophisticated modern slavery risk management approaches, both across state and Commonwealth governments, is a huge opportunity over the next couple of years.
Absolutely. Pauline?
Yeah, thank you. I do think that the government needs to kind of fully understand the risk of abuses in their supply chains and also seize the opportunity to use public procurement to protect human rights. Just to say that, for more than 2 decades, sustainability has been mainly a voluntary exercise, and directed by soft regulation. And, we've seen hundreds of standards and a patchwork of requirements, which I think makes it a bit difficult for companies to navigate. So now that we do have the UN guiding principles and the OECD guidelines as a common basis, make them mandatory where it counts, because we should not forget that states have a duty to protect human rights also through its business relationships, and that of course includes public procurement.
Absolutely. And finally, coming to you, Nick.
Yeah, look, I think I guess the simple answer is constant and consistent improvement towards best practice. I think continuing the conversation we're having now, and raising the profile and modeling the right procurement behaviours. I think we talked about before the scale of what New South Wales procures. Using that as a bargaining chip to hold suppliers and industry to account, right? Empowering agencies to leverage their procurement spend, and making sure that the right behaviours are being adhered to. I kind of think that's a key kind of focus for the next 5 years.
Absolutely. So we've got about 10 minutes left and a couple of questions here from the audience. We've got one here that I think a couple of you might be able to speak to, but it'd certainly be good to hear from you, Pauline and Nick, on this one. And actually also a private sector view from Laura would be fantastic as well. Many businesses that are contracted in the public sector are SMEs, and there's a challenge in balancing good due diligence and also not overwhelming small organisations with, really heavy due diligence requirements. And what good practice have you seen that supports SMEs in procurement while still meeting human rights due diligence? And actually, I'll let any of you jump in on that one.
Maybe I can just
go ahead, Pauline.
Oh, sorry. No, I think that this is kind of, my point, over 70% of our suppliers are SMEs. We really need to help them to fulfill our requirements and not overwhelm them with burdensome red tape or whatever. But I think this is exactly why the due diligence is such a good framework, because it's adapted to different sizes, industries, supply chains, etc. So I think the guidance and the support that we are giving, I think that has shown that it can be done also for SMEs. It's totally possible.
Just building on Pauline's point, you used the term burdensome or not being burdensome. I agree. I think a lot of our procurements is with SMEs as well, and you don't want to get to a point where SMEs don't want to tender or don't want to be involved because of the fear of not being compliant. So I think it's providing suitable guidance and frameworks to help small business make sure they are compliant and understanding what the risks are. I think that's going to be really important moving forward.
And I can continue here as well. I tried to add the link to the guidance that Pauline talked about, but I can't answer the question. So maybe can we enable that? I can provide the link. But
if you could pop it in the chat, Kristen.
The chat is enabled as well. So, but just to expand a little bit of what Pauline said, we've actually taken the guidance one step further by providing, I think, in total 14 templates. So that's policy templates, it's governance document templates, it's a pre-qualification template, it's several templates for remediation support. All of these are in Excel or Word. So what we're doing, we might get some pushback from consultancies because we're actually taking away jobs from them. But the way that Pauline and I see it is that we need to scale this up. And how do you scale it up? You provide open public sources for free to SMEs so that they can, okay, so this is what they mean. Because just looking at the legislation or the UN guiding principles, that is really, really difficult for many, many companies out there to understand what that actually means in terms of an actionable tool. So now we are providing templates for basically the whole due diligence process, everything you need, more or less. So that's one way you can step it up. And all of these templates are available in English as well. So that's why I wanted to add the link, but I'll see if I can do that now.
If not, then flick it through to me, Kristen, and I'd be happy to pop that in the chat or the Q&A. We've also got a couple of questions that relate to challenges of conducting due diligence in, more challenging geographies, including in, for example, Xinjiang. I suppose, it'd be great to hear, views from the panel on how you approach those sorts of, supply chains or jurisdictions where there are really complex and, issues of forced labour that might be state sanctioned, or there might be not a lot of transparency over supply chains and so on and so forth.
Happy to jump in, Lucy. I think at a high level, and it probably will be an unsatisfactory answer, but in these instances, you can't really push a survey out or conduct an audit. So you have to start, and look at other options available to you, which would start with some really good conversations with what I think would be your first tier suppliers. The types of scenarios you're describing are probably multiple tiers deep, and it might be difficult to surface the relevant information. We often hear that the further you go down a supply chain, the more opaque you might have in terms of accessing accurate data. But I think that really starts with a really robust conversation with your tier one supplier. Create a safe space for them to also say that they don't know, and if that's a strategic supply chain for you, then go on that exploration together around, well, what are the risks in this particular commodity? What are current sourcing behaviours? What might be new sourcing behaviours? But I think you certainly can't do it alone as the buyer, and that would also then point to industry and sector-based collaborations that we've spoken about. But I think in those instances, they would need to be really well-defined, targeted, and again, an environment for people to be able to share quite transparently what their challenges are.
It's really helpful.
Can I add something?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, China is a real challenge, I would say. I mean, we cannot do audits there anymore. Obviously, it's dangerous for the auditors, for the people that you ask questions. And many of the audit firms are not actually present there anymore. I know that, Electronics Watch are doing remote interviews, for example, that has proved quite, good. We are now doing the isotope testing for our cotton products to see whether the cotton is actually grown in Xinjiang. Obviously, we get the certificates that it's coming from somewhere else. But also, I would mention kind of, I don't know what you call that, data mining, but because the Chinese government is very proud of their poverty alleviation scheme. So the movements of people, where they actually move, you can actually follow that type of data and get really good information. We did this together with Ada and the Swedish church some time ago. So there are ways, but it's very, very difficult.
I can also add one thing on that also related to the question specifically on Xinjiang in the Q&A. So how do you do that? Well, my understanding is that due to WTO rules, public buyers are not allowed to exclude certain regions or countries from their supply chains as it stands right now. There are other legislations at EU level that sort of changes this a little bit, but as a general rule. But what we can do as public buyers is to talk to our suppliers and teach them how they can do it, because they are completely, allowed to do this. They can definitely and should definitely say in their pre-qualifications and award criteria that ask different questions to exclude the risk of Xinjiang inputs as to a relatively decent level of certainty. You can never get to 100% when it comes to these things. So I think we need to work really close with them. And we've tried in the PQQ template, that pre-qualification template that we provide, there are specific pre-qualification questions on state-imposed forced labor, state-imposed forced labor. So for forced labor, you have pre-qualification questions related to both debt bondage and forced labor. So that's a way we can nudge our suppliers to do that work for us, although we can't do it.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Kristen. And thank you to the whole panel for such a practical and lively discussion of social procurement. I'll hand back to James to introduce the second panel. And thank you everyone for your time this evening or morning.
Thank you very much, Lucy, and thank you to all of the participants in that very rich panel. A lot of food for thought there, and fantastic to see some of the examples of success that are emerging overseas and how we can potentially learn from them here in New South Wales and more broadly in Australia. Without further ado, I'm going to come straight on to our next panel. I hope they're able to join us on screen now. We are going to hear from Helena Hassani, Moe Turaga and Matilda Constable-Webb, expertly moderated by Heather Moore on the topic of pathways to inclusion. So over to you, Heather. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Great, terrific. Thanks, everyone. It's my great privilege to be able to moderate this panel tonight with some extremely distinguished speakers, many of whom probably will be very familiar to all of you. I guess by way of introduction, I might start by just sharing a few thoughts. I think it's always important to acknowledge progress, and we have made some very important strides in the area of survivor engagement and inclusion, particularly in the last couple of years. But it is also important to acknowledge that we still have a long way to go. There's still no formal or standing representation for survivors at the National Roundtable, for example. We've got really no clear roadmap for ongoing inclusion of survivors. And remarkably, unlike many other sectors, ours still has no formal mechanism for survivors to shape the systems that are meant to protect and support them. This panel is not about placing blame or pointing fingers, of course. It's really about engaging in honest discussion about how we as a movement can do better. Meaning well is not enough. Meaning well is not the same as doing well. Doing well involves testing our assumptions about what will work, what works to protect and support and empower people. Doing well is about recognizing that policy, if designed and implemented poorly, can actually contribute to harm and act as a driver of modern slavery. Doing well is recognizing that inclusion is not an entitlement, but a survivor's right. And so the key aims of this session are really to extend and elevate that conversation, to amplify survivor perspectives on inclusion and what inclusion means, and really to try and break down some of the barriers in the sector to sustainable and meaningful survivor inclusion. Without further ado, I just quickly introduce, you've probably seen the bios, but I might just introduce our speakers just quickly. Matilda Constable-Webb is a proud Wiradjuri woman. She's a mother, an author, and a nationally recognized survivor advocate who transforms her lived experience of modern slavery into systemic reform through a range of activities, including state inquiries, survivor-led frameworks. Her approach centers on embedding lived experience into policy design to create practical pathways for inclusion, justice, and healing. Moe Turaga has been a powerful voice in Australia's anti-slavery movement for a decade, sharing his personal story to shape legislation and serving on multiple advisory councils, including the Australian Government Survivor Advisory Council. He speaks regularly to government, corporate audiences, a range of other stakeholders, and was recognized for that advocacy by a 2024 commendation from yourself, James, the New South Wales Anti-slavery Commissioner. And finally, but certainly not least, Helena Hassani is the founder and executive director of Boland Parwaz, which is an NGO that brings together a range of stakeholders to combat child enforced marriage. She's transformed her personal experiences of displacement, persecution, and child enforced marriage to become a very powerful advocate for women and girls' rights. And she wears many hats. Helena is a public speaker. She's a researcher, a podcaster, and a trained practitioner in men's behavior change programs and family violence prevention. So thank you all for joining us tonight. Helena, I might start with you with a very simple but important question. What does inclusion mean to you?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for this opportunity, and I'm so delighted to be here amongst everyone. And thanks for that question, Heather. I think to me, inclusion means actively breaking down barriers and also working to ensure equal access to opportunities, resources, and decision-making processes for everyone. And in the context of anti-slavery work, inclusion is especially crucial. It involves creating safe spaces for survivors of slavery and exploitation, where they feel heard, understood, and empowered. It also means working with diverse communities and stakeholders to address the root causes of exploitation and promote systematic change. Inclusion in this context is not just about representation, but also about amplifying marginalized voices and ensuring their active participation in the fight against slavery and exploitation. And I think when we talk about inclusion, it's important to remember that inclusion of survivors of modern slavery in professional opportunities and ensuring fair compensations means recognizing their resilience, their skills, and expertise, but also to provide them with equal access to employment, training, and career development opportunities. The first thing that I really want to emphasize is equal opportunity to equal access to opportunities. I think we should really actively create pathways for survivors to enter the workforce, including through internships, through apprenticeships or job placements. And these can also involve partnering with businesses, government agencies, and not-for-profit organizations to provide targeted support and training for them. The second thing that is really important and crucial is valuing people with their lived experience. I think it's absolutely important to recognize the unique expertise and insights that survivors bring to the table. Their first-hand experiences can inform our policy development, our service provision, and awareness-raising efforts, and making their contributions invaluable, because I know that they have so much to offer. We just need to provide that space for them. The third one is fair compensation. I think workplaces must ensure that survivors are paid fairly for their work, including their consultation, public speaking, or any advocacy roles that they are performing. And this means that, like, we have to provide equitable wages, benefits, and other forms of recognition that reflect the value of their contribution. We can't just ask them to come and do the work, but forget about having a good or fair compensation. The other important thing is skill development. I know that a lot of victim survivors have so much to offer, but we should offer professional development opportunities to help survivors build the skills and knowledge they need to succeed in their chosen fields. And these may also include, like, mentorship programs, workshop, educational and employment opportunities. And the other really important thing is having a trauma-informed workplaces. We have to create work environments that are very sensitive to the unique needs of survivors, and also prioritizing their physical, emotional, and mental well-being. And this includes providing flexible work arrangements, access to mental health resources, and also fostering a supportive and inclusive work cultures. There are so many things that I want to discuss and mention, but these are the main ones.
Thank you so much for that. There is a lot in that. And I can't help but think of the words transitional justice really come to mind. I think there's so much more potential in survivor inclusion. It's not just about, there's the added benefit of gathering that expertise and galvanizing that expertise in policy improvement and design, but in fact, providing survivors with these kind of opportunities can also become a part of their own healing journeys and making meaning out of painful experiences. So I think we'll probably be coming back to a lot of the themes that you've just raised now. Thank you for that. Matilda, turning to you, you have only recently come to disclose lived experience work in the anti-slavery sector, but you've been working in other sectors like FDV and sexual violence for quite a while. What can we learn from those sectors in terms of lived experience inclusion?
Thank you, Heather, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. First, I'd like to acknowledge my Wiradjuri heritage and further acknowledge the traditional lands that I'm speaking from, that are the Wabakal and Warumi people, recognising the continuing connection to those lands, waters and communities. And I'd like to invite everyone to acknowledge and honour those same connections from wherever you may be listening from today, recognising the importance of storytelling and learning we are able to draw from today. The reason I'm drawing from that storytelling in particular, and I wanted to raise, is because understanding my experience only came from talking and sharing my experiences with other survivors. I didn't always have the terms or the understanding of what modern slavery was, let alone that it applied to my lived experience. I did, however, know what it felt like to be trapped and exploited and have that autonomy removed. My journey of healing, in particular, post-traumatic growth, started when I could put a name to my experiences. For me, like you mentioned there, that started with naming the domestic family violence experiences. This was more easily able to be identified for me because there was a lot more information out there around this on a community level. When I had that language, it opened a lot of doors to get the appropriate resources, support, and become more educated as well. That's what has grown for the domestic violence space really, really, really well. And my experiences on what they do well by starting to be more conscious of the right questions to ask so that a survivor is matched with the right supports, removing blame. While this is certainly not the case every time, it is something that is actively pursued in the domestic violence space. Which has been heavily pushed by leaders championing what happens when lived experience helps to close those systemic gaps. supporting the really stark reminders that entrenched within these processes and support systems and guidelines are real people with very real experiences. This highlights what happens when inclusion moves past tokenism, leading to growing, but still incomplete, recognition that survivors can lead, not just inform, that we have wisdom, not just wounds, and that the idea applies just as urgently in anti-slavery work. I'd like to briefly elaborate on some of those standout lessons from this space that I've learned, which is that trauma-informed doesn't mean trauma-exclusive. We don't just want rooms that are safe, but we want them to be brave. That means co-designing opportunities for survivors to speak into policy, practice, and system reform, and for people in those rooms that we may not be in yet to open the doors to support this. These moments aren't just symbolic, but they lead to better service design and better outcomes. So definitely something that the domestic violence space has started to do really, really well. But secondly, that representation really, really matters. In that space, I've felt seen and genuinely heard as I saw the rise of survivor advocacy roles, employed with titles that represented the crucial impact and value that they do provide. Positions created with intention for people with lived experience demonstrates commitment and accountability that is necessary for meaningful and lasting change in that space. Lastly, intersectionality, which for me has been one of the most crucial parts of my journey in gaining access to the right support. I didn't survive just one issue. I survived the intersection of systems failing me, from law enforcement engagement, gender-based violence, homelessness, exploitation and poverty. The family violence sector is slowly learning to centre these intersections, and the anti-slavery sector really needs to do the same or risk implicating the same harms. A great example of this is when we saw lived experience implemented in the design process of domestic family violence support. Risk tools were able to begin to reflect the lived reality and support more long-term. This is such a huge opportunity. We don't need to start from scratch. We can build from what's already working elsewhere while learning from what hasn't.
Thank you so much, Matilda. Moe, coming to you, what do you, I guess, let's build out that a bit more and take some stock of where we're at right now in the anti-slavery sector. I've been around for a while. What do you see as the major achievements over the last year? And I guess looking forward from that, what should our key goals be for progress in this space?
Yeah, hello, thank you, Heather. Can everyone hear me properly?
I can.
So I want to say hello to Helena as well. Hello, Helena, and hello, Matilda. Thank you for your voices. But firstly, I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land which I'm sitting. It's a grand country here in Bundaberg. I know the state of origin is around the corner, so go the Queenslanders. And I acknowledge those traditional, the elders past, present, and emerging as well. So I think the main thing, we have greater representation in policy discussions in New South Wales and the Commonwealth. New South Wales, Commissioner James have made survivors part of everything he does and model it to others. James and his office have successfully empowered us by giving us ways to engage openly, anonymously, or alternative ways of communication. Commissioner James has never used our trauma to exclude us from the space. He changed the space to make room for us. He has provided support and understanding, recognition of our resilience, and valued our expertise, and brave spaces are now a reality. We've also been involved in shaping the strategic plan for New South Wales from the beginning. State responses are critical for supporting survivors and addressing modern slavery risks in public procurement. We've had a good direct engagement with members of the New South Wales Parliament, and I think there's an open communication channel there. Going forward, we need to unlock the power of the state governments can bring to anti-slavery efforts in New South Wales and across Australia. So I'm also pleased that the policymakers in Western Australia, Victoria and Queensland have already consulted me directly about this. In terms of the Commonwealth, The 2020 and the 2025 National Action Plan on Modern Slavery opened the door for us to be part of the Australia's response. We have been given a seat at the National Roundtable. A pilot survivor advisory council have been convened and who have been consulted on aspects of Australia's response, but we have largely been objects of policy. Going forward, I want us to be architects of change. I want us to co-create the National Action Plan from the start. Accountability should flow to us as well as policymakers. Also, from my perspective, there has been an increasing interest by business to engage people with lived experience and a lot of opportunity for growing that engagement. I've had many opportunities to speak to large businesses where I've shared my story and my advocacy. I think this has been effective in helping business to understand modern slavery risks in operations here in Australia. The feedback I have had is that this helps to center people with lived experience in their response. It also been the first step towards deeper engagement around lived experience insights into worker engagement, effective grievance channels, and readiness for remediation. So we are growing a survivor and a peer support community. We are leading and we are ready to do more. We do need more support and investments though. Thank you.
Thank you, Moe. Matilda, I'm going to come back to you now. And I do want to encourage all of you to feel free to, if you'd like to chime in to some of the questions that have been put to other people, feel free. Matilda, what do you think are the barriers to meaningful inclusion and how can we overcome those?
This is such an important question. From my experience, barriers are not necessarily always loud or obvious. Some can be quiet and meant as good intentions behind concern or wanting to protect victims. This can ultimately lead to disempowerment, confusion, and missed opportunities to create meaningful and lasting change. When we think of who is most skilled in surviving these traumas, it's those who have lived that experience firsthand, those who have the tools and can share and want to share how they have survived. There are three key barriers I can outline and fall within areas of protectionism, transactional engagement, and economic disempowerment that I wanted to briefly talk through. But by protectionism, what I mean is to truly centre survivors, it's crucial to shift perspectives and see this experience and unique insight not as a risk to manage, but as a resource to trust. I've felt barriers come through covered with concern for me as a survivor, but also for self-preservation as well for potentially that person I might be speaking with or the company or organisation. When we do speak, at times that means reviewing systems that may have enabled harm unintentionally, and that threatens comfort. I've been in rooms when my story, my life, was referred to as being too heavy or uncomfortable. Secondly, a lack of tangible leadership is a barrier that I've seen as well. Tangible leadership and visibility is so crucial to inclusion. It's about a movement, a model. So to shift this, we need survivor leadership baked into governance structures, funding decisions, recruitment, and evaluation. This in turn supports education and awareness, which trickles down into the intersections of modern slavery as well. And lastly, I'm touching on the economic disempowerment and changing this to think about how and what metrics we use to identify success. This piggybacks off my previous point, but to support empowerment from an economic perspective for survivors, we need to recognise the value that's provided from survivors. To do that, we need scalable models that treat lived experience as expertise. For example, dedicated lived experience funding streams, survivor fellowship programs, or a national employment strategy that includes roles designed for people with lived experience of exploitation. In closing, we can overcome these barriers by embedding co-leadership to partner with survivors from day one, fund survivor-led organisations, and ensure that those who contribute to these changes are recognised, because justice requires that we create spaces where people like me don't just survive systems, but can contribute in transforming them to proactively mitigate and support our communities from risk. Thank you.
Thank you for that. That is so well said. Before we move on, I mean, do Moe or Helena, do either of you want to offer any reflections on that? No, okay. Wonderful. Thank you for that, Matilda. I mean, such wise words. And I'm particularly struck by the point you made about risk, a risk to bear or a risk to fear versus a resource to trust. And I hope that we can, I think it is, and the protectionism, I think you're spot on. In my experience and my personal experience in the sector, I think a lot of people are just worried about creating more harm. And so they just don't want to take a wrong step. And I think we need to be looking at how to create, well, I guess it comes back to the original point you made about, well, we're not starting from scratch. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's actually a tremendous amount of guidance and evidence and experience that we can be tapping to inform that journey. What we'll never know, we'll never get there if we don't try. And I heard a very wise person say once, it's not about managing risk for people, it's managing risk with people. And so I think, I really appreciate those thoughts. Moe, coming back to you, what do you think makes meaningful lived experience integration possible? So, in other words, building on the points that Matilda just made, what are the enabling factors or the enabling conditions that make effective and meaningful inclusion of survivors and people with lived experience possible?
Yeah, thank you, Heather. Well, I've said before that our representation has increased in policy discussions, and that is good. But we really need to be in a greater position of influence on decisions that impacts us. An example of this is my appointment to the interview panel that selected the Commonwealth Anti-slavery Commissioner. This is real inclusion because it involves real decision making. I should also point out that this is exactly what is outlined in a guidance document on modern slavery lived experience, engagement, and empowerment produced by the government. The document refers to something called the lived experience engagement spectrum and the inclusion ladder. So my appointment was right there at the top rung of that ladder. This document also says input from people with lived experience should only be sought if there's a scope for change based on the advice and the feedback they provide. So just having a seat at the table is not enough. Policy should be informed by us as survivors and answerable to us. We should have ways to evaluate outcomes, challenge gaps and failures, and demand adjustments to ensure policies serve our needs. Speaking from my experience, I've had strong allies in my journey. They've employed me and invested in my professional development. I get a lot of practical and logistic supports from them as well. I'm part of the team at the Australian Catholic Anti-Slavery Network and also the DOMAS 8.7 remediation service. Survivors need access to secure, fairly compensated jobs that align with their skills and aspirations. I'm not an expert in everything. None of us is. But we can build each other up. For example, I'm the first survivor in Australia to be trained up by Intertech as a social compliance auditor. It's a lengthy process, but the DOMAS team and the Intertech team are making that investment because I add unique value to their work. There's something I also want to mention as follow-up from yesterday's forum. Many survivors are eager to contribute, but they are locked in visa limbo. Without a visa or permanent residency, inclusion is not possible. I have to speak about this because too many people are waiting years for an outcome. This is a failure of justice and a failure of remedy. The sector must push for more expedited visa outcomes so we can have many more voices on the table. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Moe. Helena, coming back to you now. And before I go, I just do want to invite people to put questions in the Q&A. It looks like we're a bit ahead of schedule, so we'll certainly have some time for questions. Helena, what are there things that you'd like people to know about how to integrate lived experience in anti-slavery efforts? So real practical, tangible advice for the audience?
Sure. Thanks, Heather, for that question. But before I actually move to respond to that question, I just wanted to make a point on what Matilda and Moe said, especially in terms of people who are being exploited or experiencing modern slavery in Australia, but have visa issues. We know that visa issues have been it's always been a critical issue where people are not eligible for supporting or accessing support services just because you're on certain visa and you have no voice. No one is going to hear you just because you don't have the right visa. And I think at times we completely forget that supporting a human being shouldn't be limited to what visa you're on, or shouldn't be conditioned on your residency, your status. And unfortunately, we see that all the time, though we have improved, but there is a lot that needs to be done. Where we can say, okay, yeah, Australia, we're doing a great job. So yeah, a lot of people who are experiencing this modern slavery, they are, there are so many barriers to seek support. But coming back to your question, Heather, of course, there are several things that I would like people to know about integrating the lived expertise of victim survivors in anti-slavery efforts. I think I have already mentioned the value of their lived experience, how important it is to value we need to recognize and understand that survivors have a wealth of knowledge and expertise that can inform effective anti-slavery strategies, policies, and services that we will be delivering or we deliver to our people. And their lived experiences provide a very unique insights that cannot be gained through other means, including academic or professional training alone. I think it's important to acknowledge that they have lived a life that has been very difficult, and they have experienced so much trauma that needs to be recognized and be valued along the lines when we talk, when we work with them, when we engage with them. The second thing that we need to remember in terms of integrating the lived expertise is meaningful engagement. I think Matilda said it really well when she talked about meaningful engagement, and I do echo what she said, but also it's crucial to ensure that survivors are not tokenized or used as a spokespeople, but instead they are meaningfully engaged in decision-making processes and given opportunities to lead and shape anti-slavery efforts in Australia. We should be present at every table where decisions are made that will be affecting us. When I say us, I'm talking about people who have experienced modern slavery. I have a very strong statement that I always say: no decisions without us should be for us. And that means like we have to be included in every table that decisions are being made for people with lived experience or people who have or are experiencing modern slavery, and it can be any type of modern slavery. I think the other point that I really wanted to talk, like I think Moe, Matilda and myself have also spoken about this, but it's so important to have that trauma-informed approach. And I really cannot emphasize how important it is for every workplace to adapt a trauma-informed approach when working or engaging with survivors, recognizing the lasting impact of trauma and prioritizing their well-being and safety while working with them, while engaging with them actively. And this includes creating supportive environments and offering access to mental health resources and a fair support that could be available to them or offered to them. We just need to be kind to them, because I'm sure we all know how long it would take a person to overcome or heal from their trauma. We could be present in every table, but I think, again, it's important to be mindful of the impact that trauma could have and how long it's going to last. The other point that I wanted to talk about is diversity and intersectionality. Acknowledging that the diverse experiences of survivors and recognize that many survivors may face multiple forms of oppression or marginalization, and we have to be inclusive and intersectional in our approach and ensure that the voices of marginalized survivors are being amplified and centered. It's so important. I think Moe did, he beautifully provided examples of co-creation and collaboration, which is another point that I really wanted to talk about. It's important to engage survivors in the design, implementation, and evaluation of anti-slavery policies, programs, and services. I know that there are many or certain activities that are taking place around Australia in the anti-slavery space. However, this is to ensure that their voices and perspectives are incorporated at every stage of the process. This way, we empower survivors to rebuild their lives and thrive, while also enriching our communities and our workplaces with their valuable perspectives and expertise, and that making sure that they are included in every decisions that we make for in terms of delivering programs in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Can I want to pick up on the point around trauma-informed responses, because I think it's a term that's used a lot, and I wonder if we really, I'm not sure everyone is operating from the same understanding of what that means. I also wonder, I don't know, but I wonder if sometimes that people misconstrue having a background or an experience of trauma and carrying trauma as the same as being broken or being unable to contribute. And I think that might feed sometimes into some reluctance or fear, that protectionism that Matilda talked about. Can any of you, I guess I wonder if that resonates with any of you, and if you might shed a bit more light on what does a trauma-informed approach really mean in very practical terms. Helena, you mentioned putting the right supports in place, making resources available. Are there other things that we can offer to people in terms of what that looks like? Any of you can respond, please.
I think a really perfect example of that would be a system that's continuously and constantly prioritizing safety, but also trust, choice, collaboration, and it goes back down to that autonomy to support empowerment. That also has to encompass respect for diversity and promoting cultural sensitivity at the same time. But if we aren't aware of what it looks like, then it's going to be impossible to put it into practice as well. But to find strategies and understand with conversations, and to me, this goes back to storytelling and really having those open conversations. In order to do that in the first place, you need to create that psychological safety. And that's where it really, really starts from, to me, around being trauma-informed and having practices in place.
Great. Thanks for that, Matilda. Helena?
I think when it comes to trauma-informed, I could say that one size doesn't fit all. And what's really important for us to remember and to ask ourselves is that how does trauma-informed practice or approach look like for one person? Like, we can be very gentle. We can ask that person around their opinion about trauma-informed. And I do know that at times organizations are acting so protectively that they don't want to cause any harm. Like I think, Heather, you mentioned that earlier, that they don't want to cause any harm, that we completely be excluded from decision making just because some organizations are being very protective. But we won't cause harm if we be guided by that person and be guided by what trauma-informed looks like for that person if they come and work in a sector which is involving, like, or using their lived experiences. It's just a matter of having that smooth and gentle approach, but also be guided by what trauma-informed looks like for that person.
Yeah, thank you for that. We've got a question from Robin. There's enormous interest in engaging people with lived experience in businesses, as Moe said. What steps are being taken to build the capacity of survivors to be able to thrive in these circumstances, and how do businesses get ready to make this a success and not a further burden? Moe, I might put that one to you.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I think the simplest answer to that question is let's have a look at James' approach, and that now Chris Evans, our Anti-slavery Commissioner, on their approach in not only just leading the conversation, but also charging and paying people with lived experience to get onto their panel, their advisory panels, and making sure that conversation around any anti-slavery efforts is centered with people with lived experience in the middle of it. There's never been anyone that's outside of James' conversations that we've never been asked or referred to questions in regard to that. And the same as I can see from Chris's office now, that the engagement for people with lived experience, most businesses can be very risk averse when we talk about risks in regards to re-traumatizing people. And I think the business decide to walk beside people with lived experience, especially in this subject. They can see a wonderful journey in the midst of it all, that we are human beings, and then we can add value to their organization. So just in short.
Great, thanks. Matilda, did you want to add something there?
Just briefly, there's a terrific, the framework that's been recently released through Survivor Connections outlines a terrific pathway in order to support that inclusion and really foster any skill building that needs to be completed in order to have that effective support from survivors into a more practical solution. And the peer support framework, entitled It's Relational Remedy, is what it's called. And I think that is a brilliant example to answer your question around how to support survivors, and then also how corporations or industries can also build those skill building gaps.
Thank you. And Helena.
I think from a different perspective or coming from a different angle, we can also engage meaningfully with the communities which are being affected the most by certain types of modern slavery, to consult with them and to talk to them what their needs are and how we can engage with people with lived experience through different communities to understand the grassroots of why it's happening and what can be done to include them, to also in a way empower them to actually prevent it from happening.
Right. Yep, absolutely. I mean, that's a really good point. In the business space, especially, I actually had a conversation with the UN Global Compact about this last year when they were looking at engaging lived experience. And in fact, workers with lived experience in high-risk supply chains is a very valuable form of lived experience that the businesses could be tapping on a regular basis to not just identify problems, but actually prevent situations from devolving into something really serious. So I think prevention is a really, really critical point there. Thank you for that.
Yeah, primary prevention.
Absolutely. We got a question from Fiona here. Could you, and this will be for any or all of you, could you talk a bit more about your experience supporting other survivors? And Matilda, you just pointed to the peer support framework that's just been released. Maybe let's hear a bit more from you on that. And I particularly noting that there's really no external financial support for that work as yet.
No. No, it's not. But I think that goes to highlight how crucial and how extraordinary the work is that survivors can support through and really lead in changing those mechanisms that are designed to create spaces for survivors too. But the peer support framework outlines ways for other bodies to support education, inclusion, and really create a trusted pathway for survivors to have that meaningful impact and engagement. And it outlines ways that this can be accomplished safely, and making sure that survivor voices are incorporated into that process right from the beginning, but linking in with closing those areas where there may need to be that additional support or skill build throughout the process as well, to make sure that there's meaningful connection after the peer support framework is put into place as well. So really a long-term solution.
Mm-hmm. Moe or Helena, do you want to share a bit about your experience supporting other survivors?
Yeah, I think I personally use my lived experience to empower other young people who have experienced it or who are just coming out of their own experiences, that there's always a light after a darkness. And I use my personal experience to empower them that anything is possible, and that we just need to show that resilience that we have within ourselves, and that we can achieve anything. We can be that we can build that future that we are looking forward to. And not that I use myself as an example, but at times I have to use myself as an example, that I have lived it and I have thrived it, and now I have reclaimed my own life, and I'm trying to empower everyone else in this space, so that people see that it's possible to bring changes in their own lives.
Mm. Thank you for that. I've got another question here from Allison. Please share your opinion or your experience or the experiences of people you've helped on support provided to people leaving situations of exploitation. And can you talk a bit about the challenges there? Big question.
Yeah. I'll probably touch on a little bit of experience with the PUMP program on that, being one of the burning issues as one of our largest labour mobility operations in Australia at the moment. It is a daily struggle, understanding the 10 countries that are coming in and the language barriers that they do face when they land or when they arrive, and their understanding of their experience, what it should be, what it should be like. And sometimes those expectations don't meet the very things that they were told from their source countries when they arrived. We don't really have a parallel system, or we don't have really a guidance system in regards to, what can we do better in protecting their work rights, not only their work rights, but also their work freedoms when they find their experiences, hasn't been really what they've been told, or they can't live that better experience that they have, as we all know. And sometimes government is not ready to support it, or community, and then it falls back on communities to support people. I know in the earlier days, we have to fundraise to repatriate people's bodies back to their islands and their countries because they've passed here. And it's always a struggle. And I think, we can simplify the system a lot better without any bonded regulations in regards to our visas, in regards to their work rights that are not bonded to the employer. We can talk about that in a much more free way to define their roles. And I know the Migrant Justice Academy is coming in with some of those very good points as well. It drains our pockets in regard to the same questions as well. Most of us are doing the work that they don't want to see other people experience their own experiences. We're very much doing very preventative work to make sure those guys don't really go through what we go through, the struggles. They're not understanding where we are. They're not understanding what supports are out there. And it's pretty hard to come out of your system and then understand that you were faced with slavery. And that's one of the bigger words that for us to understand from a Pacific perspective, it didn't come to Australia. You're looking at Australia as a place of hope. Then you come in to that situations. So it is really important that we bind together as a community, that we continue to support our migrant workers, our temporary workers who are vulnerable to some of the systems that are out there in our industry. So thank you.
Thank you for that. Matilda or Helena, do either of you want to build on that, or in terms of your experiences supporting other people in similar situations? Doesn't have to be necessarily migrant workers.
I think Moe's really encapsulated it well, but I suppose just to reiterate as well, really listening and understanding survivors' voices and helping them to become a little bit more educated or understanding their experiences. Like I touched on before, education and wording and having the right language was pivotal for me to get the resources and education that I needed to get further support. So 100% agree with everything that Moe's also said. I think that's very translational into other experiences.
I think in terms of my experience, it's also important always to make sure that it is safe to intervene, because being in the community, from the community, it may not be very safe to always be involved in every case, but to make sure that safety is being considered when we support others, and with their own experiences, but also linking them to the right support services who can, if I can't because of safety reasons or because of so many other reasons, then I make sure that they're being linked to the right service to be supported.
Thank you. Thanks for that. Did I see Tim's hand go up?
No.
No, I thought I saw Tim's hand. Maybe you gave a thumbs up and I misinterpreted it. Sorry for that. We are coming to the end of our session, and I might ask each of you to offer a reflection on what is the conversation. Let's fast forward to next year. And what is the conversation we're having at this time next year? When we look back after another 12 months, give me maybe one thing that that you would like to see change. We talked about a lot of ideas, right? Amplifying survivor voices, equal access, fair compensation, skills development, peer support, safety, trust building. Yeah, I guess what is the conversation that you hope we'll be having in a year's time?
I've got two things, or maybe three. One is the labour hire licensing regulation is up and running nationally.
Yep.
Secondly, that survivors or people with lived experience get to co-create the national action plan. And my third point is that a person with lived experience is gearing up to be the next either National Anti-slavery Commissioner or the New South Wales Anti-slavery Commissioner.
So really modest targets, Moe. You really need to lift your gaze a little bit there. Oh, well, that's fantastic. Matilda or Helena, do either of you want to share some thoughts?
I'd love to see lived experience leadership written into funding contracts, governance, frameworks, and policy design. So something that is tangible and written into it.
I love that. I think I would like to have a support service which is not very punitive, which is like, where survivors can shape the new support service that will be delivered to people who are experiencing or trying to get out of their modern slavery experiences, and also having people with lived experiences in every table where important decisions are being made, which is going to affect the lives of thousands of people.
Thank you so much for those very wise words. I'm really grateful for all of you. I wanted to say that. Those words were in my heart today as I was preparing for this panel, and I want to acknowledge your bravery and your commitment and your leadership and the strength that you show, rocking up to this every day and not giving up. We have so much to learn from you, and it's just such a pleasure and a privilege to be able to be in these kind of forums with you. So I want to express my gratitude to James and the team for the opportunity to be a part of this session as well. And I want to thank all of the participants who stuck around for a very late evening, or a somewhat late evening. It's not too bad. And I'll hand the reins back over to James. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heather, and thank you to the wonderful panelists for a really very rich and challenging panel. A lot of food for thought there. I like to remind everybody that I am at the moment the New South Wales Anti-slavery Commissioner. My time will come to an end. So Moe, it's great to see you planning the runway for what comes next. Excellent. If today's discussion has raised any issues for you, you can get in contact with Linda Beard from Converge Counselling. She's going to be on standby starting in about 3 minutes for an hour. Call that number there. You might want to take a quick note of the case ID that's written there. You need to quote that case ID if you'd like to speak to Linda and have a chat to a counsellor. Finally, I'd like to thank everybody so much. We'd love to hear your feedback about the sessions over the last 2 days and how we can improve. This is especially important because we are currently planning the next edition of the forum, which will be in person. We're returning to that model. We haven't done that since number 1. Number 4 will be in person later this year. Little birdie might say November. We'll give you the dates very soon, but if you want to know the dates, the best way to know is to sign up to the IASC news and events. QR code on the bottom left there. Point your phone at that, take a quick QR code through to that. If you're more here for the business stuff, but you've stuck around anyway, first of all, well done. You can follow the other QR code at the bottom right there, which will take you to our due diligence newsletter, where you can find out about lots of things happening in this space. So with that, I want to thank everybody for the very rich conversations here at the third edition of the Anti-Slavery Forum. It's wonderful to see the progress that we're all making together as we try and build stronger and more effective and impactful systems to ensure that we realise the human right to be free from slavery here in New South Wales and beyond. Thank you all so much. We'll look forward to seeing you at the fourth edition. Good night.
Night.